Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on the history of tag through personal memories, what you call an exercise, if not an actual experiment in the oral history of archaeology. It's part of, I'm chairing it, my name is Tim Champion from Bournemouth, Southampton. I've got, I suppose, the merit of being in at the beginning of the sort of proto-tag, although my memories of it are somewhat dim. I should say, before we really get going, that this is part of a project on the oral history of archaeology being organised by Pamela Jane Smith from Cambridge, who has set up this session. So thank you to Pamela. As you can see, the session is being videoed, or is being recorded, and we had to thank a team of volunteers who are recording this for perpetuity, including Abir Gupta, Sam Wakeford, and Owen Vincent. I will also now put in a short plug. This project is unfunded, and there is on sale copies of videos from previous sessions, not in tag, but previous oral histories of famous archaeologists, going at a remarkably bargain price, available from Pamela afterwards, plus whatever donation you might like to make in addition to the cost price to fund the expenses of the people recording this and to keep the project going. And as well as Pamela, we should also thank the distinguished archaeologist Thurston Shaw for some limited funding for the project and also for the supply of cake. As I say, this is part of a project Pamela has been organising in the oral history of archaeology, which actually intersects with other projects in the history of archaeology, which in itself has become a discipline with more rigorous methodological and theoretical approaches in the last few years. One can see a significant increase in the output of serious investigations of the archaeology history. The history of archaeology goes beyond simply the big names and the big excavations, but is beginning to explore, partly through biography or in many cases autobiography, but also through the history of institutions, the history of ideas, but also the history of conflicts and arguments within archaeology, how the subject has developed over the last 200 or more years. And we're going to focus today on the history of one organisation, TAG. We have assembled, to my left and right, a number of people who played various roles in organising it, participating in it, or have various memories of it. But I think one of the purposes of this afternoon is not to limit it to the speakers we have lined up here, but to get as many recollections as possible. And we would encourage people to contribute with their memories or their questions, or if necessary, their outright disagreements. But one of the things I think is likely to happen is that there are serious disagreements about what happened when. We have, with some difficulty, established a broad chronology, which is an appropriate thing for archaeologists to do. This is number 30 in the numbered series of conferences, which started number 1 in Sheffield in 1979. Before that, there were sort of pre-tag meetings, or ur-tag, or proto-tag, or something. 2 events, one which took place in Southampton in December 1977, and one which took place in Sheffield in 1978. So this is endless, sort of endless confusion about the first meeting, to which we could mean either 77 or 79. And don't be too confused when people start talking about them in the early days. The format, as I say, we're going to ask a number of people to contribute. One of the things which one of the founders, Colin Renfrew, laid down in the early days was largely futile attempt to impose order on speakers, to keep to time, to keep it brief, and to allow time for questions and discussion. And we will hear more of that, I'm sure, in at least 1 or 2 of the reminiscences later on. But we will try to keep the presentations from the floor fairly brief and allow time for comments and questions. And I hope we will also be able to expand not just on the history of TAG as an organisation and as a conference, but also on the, sort of the broader development of archaeology, which it played a significant part, especially perhaps in the early days when, as we hear, it came into being at a time when universities had been expanding rapidly, at a time when there was a growing ferment of theoretical thinking in archaeology. We had a number of references yesterday in a session on the events, the revolutions of 1968. Nobody, in fact, mentioned two critically important events of 1968, which were the publication of David Clarke's Analytical Archaeology and Renfrew's New Perspectives. And to anybody who was a student back in those days, these two things were something of a bombshell in the way that archaeology was written about and thought about. And if anything, one could perhaps date the revolution in archaeology from those events in 1968, if not from a bit earlier. But I think enough from me. We're going to, because there are a number of sessions going on, and people, one or two panel members will be coming in and out to go to other sessions. We have, in a moment, the two of the founding fathers of TAG, Colin Renfrew and Andrew Fleming. But before we go to them, I'm going to ask Richard Bradley to speak first, because he has to go somewhere else more important for a meeting at 2 o'clock. So, Richard. And we're also going to keep this as informal as possible. We're not going to sit behind the podium. If we can hear us properly, then we'll reminisce from a sitting position. Richard.
Well, I dispute the more importance. It is simply that one of my postgrads has put on another session in which I'm also giving about 1.5 papers. So I feel I have to support that in the way that all of us support people we're supervising. It's unfortunate that it means I'm speaking out of chronological order in a sense, because I had nothing to do with the origins of TAG, although I was one of the 4 individuals allowed into the Ur-TAG, the second Ur-TAG. That was myself, Bob Chapman, Mike Rowlands, and late Andrew Sherratt. And since then I have been to many of these meetings. But Tim made the point that 1968 was a pivotal year in the development of archaeology. For me it was a particularly pivotal year because it was the year I managed to shake off my law studies and actually emerge into archaeology, a field which I rather little about, I think. And I think that really brings home the first point I want to make. Coming virtually self-taught from amateur archaeology into professional archaeology, it was extraordinary how difficult it was to meet one's own contemporaries, to engage in any form of debate, any form of discussion about current ideas. And I suppose also it was extremely difficult for people of my generation to find venues where we could try out our ideas on a live audience. And I think there are perhaps 2 precedents, in a sense, whether conscious or unconscious, for TAG as it emerged. The first is something called the Conference of Young Archaeologists, which I attended, I think, several times. And I think the last one I went to was where I first met Jim Champion, and we calculate that was probably in 1971. This was essentially a conference in which people invited themselves to speak. It was a meeting of a generation, and the generation was always redefined at each business meeting so that the maximum age was changed so we could keep going. When I left, young was defined as ending at 32. I believe subsequently the bar was raised for some of the regulars to keep going. I wasn't actually 32 then. But it was a very valuable occasion for trying out ideas on an audience which was almost entirely a student audience. The other precedent, if you like, were 3 very major international meetings. The first 2 organised by Peter Rucko and the third by Colin, which were held successively twice in London and then in Sheffield, and led to 3 enormous edited volumes: Domestication of Plants and Animals, Man, Settlement and Urbanism, which was the first one I attended, and the Explanation of Culture Change. These, I suppose, were the showcase where those British archaeologists who were engaging with theory had a chance to put their ideas over, but in particular it was the first time when unknowns like Lewis Binford and Ken Flannery were speaking on British soil. Well, this had a cataclysmic effect on those who were attending, especially the majority of us who had no first-hand contacts with people who would describe themselves as theorists. This opened a new world to us. But at the same time, it was very much a closed meeting, particularly the Alcoa ones, in that land settlement and urbanism, the formal presentations took place in one room, and those who either had been turned down in offering papers or had not ventured to offer papers watched the proceedings by closed-circuit television from another room. The cameras were operated by students with a mischievous sense of humour, and frequently the images on the screen were not of the speaker, but very often of famous people asleep. And such was the enjoyment coming through the party wall that some of the good and the great actually transferred to our session. Every time I ever met Desmond Clark was where he said, "Do you mind if I join you? It seems to be more fun in here." But it did make a serious point that again there was a separation between people whose reputations were established and the people who wished to make careers in archaeology, who in a sense were looking for an audience, looking not just to fill out their CVs, but to try out ideas on their contemporaries, to engage in discussion. And that is the context, I think, in which that second Ur tag really showed the way forward. And I think the point that I want to make is that TAG has succeeded by bringing together both those two strands. First of all, a professional conference which has become increasingly international in terms of the people contributing, and which has been involved in a lot of the most exciting live debates. And even for those of us who are not necessarily engaged at the cutting edge of theory, it is a wonderful way of catching up, a wonderful shop window. But for those of us who are also engaged in teaching, it is crucial because it has taken over that role that was never very well fulfilled by the Conference of Young Archaeologists in allowing graduate students to try out their ideas on their contemporaries and also on their seniors, if you can use the word. And I think the last thing I'd say is on several occasions in the history of TAG, I've had the same conversation with Barbara Bender. And I think it makes a point about the conference which is entirely to the credit of TAG as an institution. And it was essentially a question of, should we sit there in judgment listening to younger people speaking and ask questions as if we're trying to assess their merits? Or should we contribute, in which case are we hogging the limelight? And at each occasion we've discussed this, we've come to the conclusion that if we can get the politics, the personal politics of it right, the virtue of this conference is that all the speakers in the session are there on equal terms, whether they're employed, unemployed, newcomers or ancestors, as we seem to have become. And I think that is why TAG not only succeeded when it was set up, why it was needed, but most important of all, why it's lasted 30 years and still serves a purpose. And I can't think of any other forum that achieves that.
Thank you very much, Richard. Admirably brief and to the point. So I know Richard has to go to another session in a moment, and we'll come to other substantive contributions, but I don't know if there are any comments or questions or comments to Richard at this point on what he has said.
Perhaps I could, since I'm allowed to be anecdotal, perhaps I could share a story with you which I don't think is widely known, except the people I told it this morning. The Man Settlement and Urbanism was one of the rare occasions where David Clarke, at the end of his life, came out of Cambridge to speak to a conference. And I think it can act as a parable of how disconnected people with an interest in archaeological theory were. I knew David very slightly and was waiting outside the conference, and he came in and said, "I'm looking for the organiser. Man called Ukka, I suppose he's a Nigerian or something." I think that says something about the degree to which we were really getting to work together in those days.
I'm sure Peter would have laughed at that one himself.
Not sure David Clark would.
Right. Well, in that case, I think we move on to our next speaker.
Thank you. I think Andrew and I claim that ancestral role, and I can say it certainly didn't seem like Urtag in 1977 when the thing happened. And as Richard was saying very well, I think there was a lot of interest developing here and there in theoretical archaeology. 1968 was a very important year. I'd been to the SAA, the Society for American Archaeology, in about 1972, I think, was my first visit. And I've been hugely impressed at the way there really seemed to be discussion and theoretically interesting papers there. I'm not sure that's remained true of the SAA, but it certainly seemed to be at that time. And as everybody's been saying, it should be remembered how moribund the theoretical scene was then. And if you went to a lecture at the Prehistoric Society, you got some very interesting new data, but you got very little presentation of what the ideas underlying the research might be or what motivated the research direction. And the same was true of the Society of Antiquaries. Indeed, just in the past year or two, I've been to one or two meetings at both societies, and I'm not sure the situation is entirely transformed at either. But anyway, there was a feeling, which Andrew had and which I shared, that we really ought to try and have some meetings which were essentially about theory and discussing the ideas underlying the research, not just the hard data emerging from the research. And so, as has been said, the first two meetings were joint meetings between the two departments. They were quite straightforwardly the research students and the graduates of the department in Sheffield and the department in Southampton. And if you look at the programs which are preserved in some holy archive or other, then you will see the names of the research students there, and they were sometimes encouraged, sometimes constrained to give a paper. And the idea was that it would be informal, there would be discussion, there were of course no parallel sessions, so one hoped to discuss everything, and it was really a great success. The first one in Southampton was a success, so we did it again in Sheffield, and then we invited Richard Bradley and Mike Rowlands and Bob Chapman and Andrew Sherratt, as Richard reminds us. And it was Mike Rowlands who was not at all gracious about the invitation and said, "This is a disgrace. What on earth do you think you're doing?" And we're all rather surprised by this. He said, "This should be an open meeting. It's disgraceful you should be hogging it to yourselves," and really fired a lot of rounds at us. So I said, "Okay, well, we'll make the next one an open meeting." And so that's how the first official tag happened in Sheffield 30 years ago. And there were one or two important things about them. They were for research students as well as staff, and they were for discussion. And one of the battles we've had in years since has been to try and persuade session organisers at TAG to leave time for discussion. If there is time, the discussion always emerges, but not enough time is left, and the timekeeping isn't sufficiently punctual. Tim Darvill can speak about timekeeping, but that was an early criticism and remains a criticism. But the social side was very important. And at the first tag in Southampton, I remember we had a marvellous dinner, cold dinner, salad provided by members of the department, which was offered to the guests, and the same happened the second year. It wasn't possible after that for everything to be free, but the tradition started then. Obviously one can't accommodate everybody free of charge that comes to tag, but the tradition is still there that if you bring your sleeping bag, you ought to be able to find a corner somewhere to put it. In other words, if you're unwaged, you can really hope not to have to pay for a room, and the conference fee has always been kept low, which is one reason, perhaps not the only reason, but one reason that one continues to have research students and younger archaeologists at TAG, as well as some of the salaried professionals. And another important thing was the TAG party, which has always been important. Sarah Champion, alas, no longer with us, but she was one of the great spirits there doing the disco, and so the TAG party was always a great occasion, remains a great occasion. Some are better than others. And one other thing worth mentioning, it was in 1980, so there must have therefore been between the two tags that a lot of us went across to the Society for American Archaeology in Philadelphia, and that was in April, therefore it was long before the 1980 tag, and we put on sort of the Brits come to the SAA, and sort of had a presence there, which was subsequently published. But everybody, the one thing that everybody remembers about the SAA meetings in Philadelphia of 1980 was the party, because we'd arranged that everybody coming from the team was to get a bottle of malt whisky, Scottish malt whisky, let me be clear, Scottish malt whisky, single malt, indeed so, at the duty free. And so we managed, I don't quite know how, in the hotel in Philadelphia to get the presidential suite without charge. We were treated much more kindly than we've been at some subsequent SAAs, I can tell you. A battle with the hotel police. But anyway, we got this. And everybody that wasn't invited came. I think we'd forgotten to invite the president of the SAA, but he rolled up. Everybody came. As they came in the door, they were given a glass of malt whiskey. Then we, of course, had other drinks there as well. And that was really a great party, and I think that was when TAG came to the United States, and the party spirit certainly prevailed. I think I've probably spoken long enough. There'll be other opportunities to chip into discussion, but I will say one other thing. It dawned on me when I was just doing sort of looking at where tags have been, that one thing about TAG that perhaps is rather important, it's already been touched on, the TAG has not been particularly a feature of the so-called golden triangle of Oxford, Cambridge and London. If you look at where tags have been 3 times, they've been 3 times appropriately to Sheffield and Southampton, including this one. If you look at where tag has been twice, in the order where it's scored twice, you have Reading, Durham, Cardiff, Glasgow, Bradford, Lampeter, and then that's it, I think. Then if you look where it's been once, you have Cambridge, UCL, Newcastle, Oxford, and so on. And I'm afraid if you look where it's never been at all, although it's been twice to Glasgow, it's never been to Edinburgh for reasons too complicated to go into. I'm afraid it remains the case. So I think one of the important things about TAG is it really has got around the place. And for somebody like myself who resides in Cambridge now and for many years since, TAG has been the agency by which I've slept in more halls of residence than I care to remember.
It's wonderful how stories of that party sort of keep escalating, and the ripples of that party have sort of circulated in archaeological circles for many years. But probably most of what we said is true.
It's becoming true.
It's becoming true. So, Andrew, we'll open up after we've heard from Andrew.
My memory of Philadelphia is a Colin sending round a letter beforehand to all the participants, quoting from the famous Crispin speech of Henry V. You know, and gentlemen in England still abed will think themselves accursed they were not here. Honest. Anyway, I'm going to give you a relatively personal history. I always thought of the best oral history projects, the one where you sit your informant in his favourite pub, in his favourite armchair, with his favourite pint in his hand. But I'll do my best, in slightly more inhibiting circumstances. I studied archaeology in Cambridge in the mid-1960s, and there was no explicit theoretical archaeology there at all, really. It was all implicit. But I do remember in my finals paper being set this question about what's the difference between deductive and inductive approaches in archaeology. I probably gave quite a feisty answer, but unfortunately I remembered my Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was always talking about deducing things. So I said, that must mean that deducing must be all about observing things and coming to conclusions, where obviously inductive reasoning is the other sort, where you have an idea and you work out its consequences. Well, I see from your faces that you realise that I was 100% wrong. But I hope the examiners were kind to me. Anyway, I got a job in Sheffield in 1967. I was dead lucky because I was only 23 at the time. And one of the exciting things about the first few years in Sheffield was that Colin was starting to teach theory. He was teaching a course on models and explanation in archaeology. And at this distance, I can't remember whether I sat in on that course or not, but it certainly feels as if I did, because Colin's ideas on theory permeated the whole department, and it went into vividly I remember, it went into the dissertations of the students who were just starting to do single honours for the very first time in Sheffield. And one of the best things in Sheffield was in December 1971, when there was the famous explanation and models conference in Sheffield. Appropriately enough, it was held in the modern geography department, which was full of hexagons, or Thyssen polygons, you could say. And it was our first introduction to some of the great international names, in particular some of the Americans, and most notably Lou Binford. And it was an unforgettable experience. Lou was larger than life in several senses. And to people of my generation, he reminded me of nothing so much as those hot gospelers we used to listen to sometimes on Radio Luxembourg. You know, the ones that said things like, "And there will be wars and rumors of war." Well, Binford was a bit like this, and talking about wars and rumors of war. And it was very exciting to be among those people, to be listening to them, and above all, to be present at an occasion where people were excited by ideas, where ideas had preeminence, and that was wonderful, for me at least. And then, shortly after that, in the summer of '72, Colin came here to take a chair at Southampton. And one thing I was determined on was that his disappearance wasn't going to mean the disappearance of archaeological theory from Sheffield. So I took over my own version of that course and taught it for 3 or 4 years. And then we come to 1976, really, so the winter of '76-'77, when TAG was conceived. How it happened was, I went down to Southampton to give an arts art lecture, probably on Dartmoor, I guess. And afterwards, I went to stay at Colin's place, in his house in Eastleigh. I remember vividly the bark cloth decorations on the walls, because it was only, I think, a couple of years after he'd been on his South Sea Island excursion. And I no doubt at one stage a nice bottle of Highland Park made its appearance. I wouldn't be surprised. Anyway, you know how it is if you go speaking somewhere and you get put up. You sit there, relaxing and putting the world to rights. And we started talking about archaeological theory. And it turned out we were both a little bit gloomy about the way it was going. And in my mind, I have quite a vivid memory of this, there were 2 reasons for this, preeminently. One of them was had been the death that previous summer of David Clarke at the shockingly early age of 39. It was rather shocking and horrifying, both in personal terms and also in intellectual terms, really. I can't say I knew David Clarke very well, but there were an awful lot of that generation of archaeologists who were his students, and they mourned him deeply, again, both personally and intellectually. And so, in a way, archaeological theory was feeling bereft in that sense. And the other thing I remember was that Colin's theory hadn't entirely had its own way. There were a couple of articles in Antiquity, and maybe 1 or 2 other places, which had been distinctly critical. Perhaps the most famous one was the Jaquetta Hawkes article, The Proper Study of Mankind, which I seem to remember was complaining about the ugliness of histograms or something. But there was that curious sense that Glyn Daniel was sitting there as the editor of Antiquity, very properly performing his role, presenting lots of different points of view, but also perhaps slightly mischievously chucking the odd hand grenade the way of archaeological theory. And Glyn, of course, was a formidable presence in many ways, and in those days politically as well. And so that felt like a bit of a threat, a bit of a difficulty in some ways. And so I forget which one of us it was who suggested that we might perhaps have a little Sheffield-Southampton colloquium on theory to try and keep it going. And I remember one of the elements of the early conversation was very much a missionary thing. It was the idea was around that not that many of us were doing theory or thinking about theory, that theory was a precious plant that might wither on the vine if we didn't tend it. And that was very much the thinking behind the Southampton-Sheffield tag as it became. And as people have said before, we had these two early meetings. The Sheffield one was in a venue called Sulby Hall Residence, which no longer exists now. One of the scary things about having been around Sheffield, and I guess other places for so long, is that a lot of the buildings that went up in the 60s are now rubble. In fact, Sulby Hall has been replaced by a student village, which has just gone up. So we can't take you to one of the venues of one of the Prototag, but it was in the library in Sulby Hall residence in Sheffield. And I remember very much there was an extremely pleasant atmosphere at those two early tags. I think Sheffield and Southampton as communities felt a great kinship with each other. We were all of much the same age and generation. We were young Turks in a way. The world was kind of at our feet. And it was really, because archaeology was beginning to expand. We were getting student numbers. We were able to make new appointments. It did seem like the world was at our feet. So there was this very, very good atmosphere between us. And I always felt that Sheffield and Southampton were like sister departments, in a sense, bringing archaeology out into mainstream university departments. Southampton was doing very much the same sort of thing, and I would say Reading actually, doing the same sort of thing in the south of England as we were doing in Yorkshire. And the same kind of process was going on. So it was quite opposite, I think, that Sheffield and Southampton were the two places which gave rise to TAG. And then there was the big tag, and I don't remember the business about Mike Rowland. That's quite interesting. But certainly, we did think it would be an interesting idea to make the third tag open. And we got no idea what was going to happen. And it was wonderful that quite a lot of people came. And there was the biggest lecture theatre in the basement of the Arts Tower in Sheffield. I don't know how many that holds, maybe a couple of hundred. But it was pretty full. And that was really gratifying. And I've got rather daft memories of it, really. I remember Robin Dennell and I were both dressed at our most ethnic. His stuff, probably genuine Afghan. My stuff, more like from Bring It All Back Home in West Street in Sheffield. But people did comment on our sartorial elegance or otherwise. But the thing that was most striking intellectually, of course, was that Colin's style of theory, if I can put it that way, as just a shorthand, didn't have its own way, because there was this guy called Ian Hodder who stood up and started saying culture is meaningfully constituted, and kind of putting the platform for what was later to become cognitive archaeology and so on and so forth. And then, blow me down, a few hours later, Mike Rowland stood up and gave us his Marxist archaeology. And that was a real eye-opener, because, for me at any rate, because I realized that theory was pluralist, that there were several different strands. And people like me, when they were talking about theory, had to rejig our lectures a bit. So we started talking about the kind of parade of the isms. And former Sheffield students will probably groan with recognition at remembering some of the isms that I trundled them through during the 1980s, before someone had a better idea. So that was where, by coincidence, the expansion of TAG geographically and in terms of inclusiveness also coincided with its pluralism, and that's been an exciting feature in itself. It became a platform where people wanted to bring new ideas in. And I remember, quite often people would host a tag, and then it would turn out that the host department would want to push a particularly strong idea. I remember John Barrett making an impact at one of the Glasgow tags, talking about agency, and so on. So people have, and people have used tag as a good way of getting over new ideas. It's more difficult, I think, now that there are so many coeval sessions. There are 12 or 13, I think, at the present tag, which is probably a record. And it's more difficult, I guess, to get one's point of view across to a big audience, because there's no guarantee that they're going to come and listen. Anyway, I think I've said enough. I was concerned with the genesis of tag, and maybe I can make some contributions about the nature of tag and what's good and bad about it, perhaps, in the general discussion.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think we would like to allow plenty of time now for contributions or questions from anybody else. We've heard mostly from Colin and Andrew about the early days, the initial formation of it. I think perhaps we'll hear a little more in a moment from Clive, who will have to write in script about how it developed initially. But if we concentrate, try and focus memories on the earliest days to start with, then we'll come to the later history of it. Chris.
You mentioned Mike Rowlands. Actually, there was an early link to Scandinavia or Denmark, and that was created by Mike Rowlands, because around 1975 or 6, Jonathan Friedman came over to take a position at the anthropology department in Copenhagen, and he came from London, where he had done seminars with Mike at that time. And he started a seminar that I joined, and some others, about local and global systems and social evolution, where we read Maurice Godelier and Wallerstein and so on, and worked on that kind of Marxist world systems. And Mike Rowlands came over, and we got friends, and actually it resulted in a book later called New Directions in Scandinavian Archaeology. And then Mike invited me and others over in the late 70s to some conferences where I met all of you sitting there. So there was that very early link through Mike Rowlands, actually, that opened up that connection. Later we then copied tag in Scandinavia. We created Nordic tag. And that's been by 84, 85, I think it was that late actually, and it's still running. And doing well in Scandinavia. So you have had offspring actually in Scandinavia. And I think it's important to note that there were these very early connections, and we share that concern about theory and discussing theory.
Perhaps I could pick up one point which both Colin and Andrew made, which about the late 1960s and early 70s were a particularly interesting time, both in the expansion of the English university system in general, but also of archaeology in particular. And that those developments did, I think, largely bypass Oxford and Cambridge, and to a large extent bypass London and the institute as it then was. To some extent that caught up later, but the late 60s and early 70s did see the foundation of a new department in Sheffield, with it started from scratch in early 63, was it?
Yes, that was Warwick Bray, I think, in 63 or 64.
63 or 64 in Sheffield. The Southampton department started in 67, and the Reading department was, I think, reformalised in, I think Richard said 71. So a period of time, there were others which started or expanded at that time. And that meant the development of archaeology as an academic discipline in centres which were not the traditional centres of archaeological study. Up until then, the main places if you wanted to study archaeology were in Oxford, Cambridge, London, and slightly earlier Liverpool.
Edinburgh.
Edinburgh existed and then Cardiff came in as well, but a limited number of them. But most of the expansion of the late 60s and early 70s actually took place in places where archaeology had not been present to any significant extent at all. And by the by the early 70s, that expansion was largely over. I came to Southampton in 1972, and I don't think there was another job advertised in my field for something like 7 or 8 years, because the expansion had stopped, and the posts were full up with people about 3 years older than me. For a long time, but Southampton did manage to expand. With Colin at head, we went from 4 people in 1972 to I think 7 by about 1977 when TAG started. But that was really the tail end of the expansion, and needed some careful politicking and empire building by our then head of department to achieve it. But that phase of expansion did bring a lot of people into academic posts in archaeology. And as Andrew said, a lot of them, a lot of us were quite young. We also came from very diverse backgrounds. There were not many places doing archaeology to supply the graduates, let alone the PhD graduates, to take up the academic posts. So it may sound unbelievable now, but a contemporary of mine that also was offered a lectureship at the university before he'd taken his finals. There were just no graduate economists around the time, so he walked straight into a job, and that's probably not the only one. Certainly in archaeology, many of the people taking up posts in an academic archaeology at the time came from backgrounds which were not in archaeology. Many of us had first degrees in other things. So there was perhaps a nucleus of Cambridge people who may have known each other, to some extent at least, as Cambridge undergraduates. But many of us came from other fields. So, as Richard said, he'd been studying law. I was an ex-classicist, David Hinton was ex-historian. And at one point, there were actually, at one point we appointed somebody in Southampton who actually had a degree in archaeology, didn't we, Clive? But it did mean that the people who were colleagues in an academic profession had come from a wide variety of backgrounds, and probably many didn't know each other, or didn't know each other very well. Richard referred to 1 or 2 conference-type organisations which had provided the opportunity. I think the other major meeting place for archaeologists at the time was something else that doesn't really happen anymore, and that was big excavation projects. So generations of archaeologists who'd grown up in the 50s met each other at big projects like Snail Down or Gwithian. In my day in the 60s, many of us started our archaeological careers by digging on one or other big project. So I started in digging in Winchester. And pubs do seem to play an important part in the history of archaeology. I first met John Collis in the garden of a pub in Winchester when we were both digging there. But apart from that, there were not many opportunities for social, even, or let alone academic or intellectual interaction with one's colleagues. And so something which cut across the sort of rather empirical basis of period conferences did offer an opportunity for people from a wide variety of backgrounds who were predominantly young, were predominantly interested in theoretical ideas, could actually meet each other and converse.
One of the things that has always struck me about archaeology, in a sense, is how we borrow ideas from other disciplines. And I just wondered if there was a sense that people saw something similar to TAG going on in other disciplines that provided some sort of inspiration for us at the beginning.
No, I think is the answer. I can't think of anything. Interesting question, but I think the answer is actually no.
Not in an organisational sense, but in an intellectual sense, there are some parallels between the developments that were taking place in some areas of geography and some areas of archaeology. To the point where I remember one of our professors of geography here saying that archaeology was making all the mistakes that the geographers made 5 years earlier. But as an institution, bringing academic colleagues together to talk, no, we were actually discussing this earlier. We couldn't think of anything parallel in any other discipline.
My name is Jennifer Bracewell. I'm a PhD student at McGill University. I was just asking because I am from North America and anthropology and archaeology are so inseparable in the North American departments. I was wondering if that was also, especially in theory, so I was wondering really how much anthropology had to do with this new interest at the time in theoretical archaeology.
Not much at that time, I would say. Certainly from the Cambridge perspective, the two departments didn't really get together, though it's nominally an archaeology and anthropology tripos with a common part one. They went their different ways, and at that time, to some of us, to me anyway, it looked as if anthropology was going around in circles talking about kinship all the time, and certainly the anthropologists of the time then had no interest whatever in material culture, which they dismissed as obsolete ethnography, I think it's fair to say. So it should have been, but of course the Oxford Department of Anthropology was completely up some ivory tower from which it not really ever descended. I believe there was a Department of Anthropology in Durham, but I never heard what it did. So I think not much is the answer to your question.
Just a moment. Yes.
I was just wondering if any women were involved in these early stages.
There were quite a few. Certainly Sarah Champion was one who was no longer with us, and there were others too.
Robin Torrance.
Robin Torrance,
who was a big breadth of theory from across the Atlantic, and who was, of course, at Sheffield for some years.
That's right, but now in Australia, I mean, if she were here, she'd be on the panel, but she's in Australia at this time.
As far as I can see, the first person to give the first paper of the first tag was Pat Phillips.
Who's, alas, sadly no longer with us as well. Otherwise, she might well be on the platform, as it were. She was a dynamic lady, as you may know, but sadly died some years ago.
The first of the preliminary meetings in Southampton had, according to the programme, 25 speakers organised with papers, of whom 5 were women. Whether that is above or below the average that you'd expect for an archaeological conference in '77, I don't know.
The gender balance has changed enormously in the last 30 years. And I think one thing as an historian, my name is Pamela Jane Smith, one thing as an historian I've learned is that we can't expect from history what we want for ourselves today. So what you have here is 5 out of 25, which is, for gender balance, excellent for the era. Unfortunately, 2 are deceased. Mary Bradford is in Scotland, but I couldn't contact her. Hilary Howard really wanted to come but could not. So I did trace all the women except for Robin in Australia. But thank you for asking the question because it brings them out. Thank you.
Postgrads were requested by our head of department at the time to all be chairman of sessions and discussants and things like that. So for myself, it was my very first semester. So I'd only been in Southampton about 3 months. And my principal job was to actually keep the time on the time clock that you've mentioned already. And I remember very, very distinctly having to tell Paul Mellors to sit down and shut up. Because he was on and on. Head on. I'm sorry that Hilary wasn't able to come, because that would have been great fun. She was the grand cook that Colin mentioned.
That's right.
And I remember helping her serve in the kitchen and stuff like that. But that was very, very good.
Anybody else present at either the first Southampton or the first Sheffield pre-meetings? Come on.
Didn't see that.
I just thought it was amazing, as you said, as a postgraduate, to have the opportunity to try your ideas out to people outside your department and get responses to them. And the one response I do remember was Mike Reynolds Mike Rowland's coming up to me after my paper and saying, if you're really thinking about these things, you know, you ought to be considering moving to archaeology, to anthropology. Archaeology is far too narrow for you. You take the advice.
Thanks very much. Well, hang on just a moment.
No,
You ready?
yes.
Oh.
I wanted to ask you, what was the reaction of sort of the old guard at the time towards TAG? Do you have any remembrances of that?
You know, my own take on that was just being, there wasn't really any reaction because they didn't bother to know about it, and they certainly didn't come. And so I think they were safely, what was David Clark saying, encapsulated cysts or whatever it was. I would say there was no antagonism because I don't think they were particularly invited, maybe in some occasions, and so I think it passed them by, but Andrew might have a different impression.
No, that's quite right. I mean, we were a generation that had the world at feet, really, in that sense. I mean, okay, there were Eminence Grises, whose retirement date was eagerly awaited from various different famous universities. I remember that everyone knew exactly when certain people were going to be 65 or 67.
They still do, Andrew.
Indeed. You know, this was very much a word at our feet scenario. We wouldn't have cared. You know, we perhaps have enjoyed it if some of the older people had reacted in a more waspish way, as some of them did occasionally when you bumped into them. I remember, this is unfair to quote a particular individual, so perhaps I wouldn't name him, but I remember one quite famous archaeologist saying, "You don't need any of this tag-type theory. All you need is a countryman's eye and a good pair of boots."
Any more comments on the stage? Oh, let's move to our next witness, Clive.
Yes, back in 1977, I was even younger than the photograph there, and I'd only just started in Southampton 3 years before. And what I remember about that 77 tag was, and this dates it, doesn't it? Was, of course, this was the time of great industrial unrest, and we were all sitting there waiting for the power cuts to happen. And when the power cuts came, the room went out. But even more importantly, this meal that Hilary Howard had cooked, which we are remembering, she couldn't cook it because she was doing it all on baby belling stoves and so on in one of the rooms. And somehow she managed to make this meal by the power of candlelight. I definitely have that memory. And just to give you another idea of the times about networking and why it was so important to come together, you were under such financial stringency in those days that there was this thing of British Telecom at the time that the tariff for making a phone call went up after lunch. Sorry, it came down after lunch, didn't it? It came down after lunch. So you were under edict not to phone outside of Southampton until after lunch. And I believe in Sheffield they had one phone in the department. So somehow you have to arrange to phone, and someone would be standing by that phone who would answer it, and you'd get passed on to the right person. Communication was very difficult. There was no email, texting, that sort of thing. It was a very different world. But I think one of the successes of TAG, just to give you a statistic, is that in the period between 2001 to 2007, in other words, the RAE return, 750 people graduated with a PhD in archaeology. God knows where they've gone, but I mean, it's just unbelievable, and it's that appetite to do research which I think really marks out archaeologists, and which TAG has been largely the fuel and the driver for that enthusiasm to carry on. I mean, that's a remarkable statistic. I mean, it'll be interesting when all the figures get published tomorrow to find out how other disciplines of larger size actually compare to us. But 750 completed PhDs is mind-boggling. Anyway, one thing, hearing my honourable friends talking about the early TAG, I have to say something about Cambridge. And although we seem to be airbrushing Cambridge out of the history of TAG, and that may be the case, there were some important conferences that took place there, which I see as another motor for TAG. The first one was organised by Matthew Spriggs and was published as about BAR Red Series number 5 or something, which was Archaeology and Anthropology. And that has a kind of, this is to follow up Colin's point about anthropologists not listening to us, but that had yet another one of these magisterial papers by Edmund Leach, From the Bridge again, in which he said you can't do anything. And I remember going up to several of these conferences. They were held in that funny little theatre in St. John's. And the School of Pythagoras. The School of Pythagoras. And we would all go up there, and we would all troop up behind Colin to hear the great address. And I remember a catastrophe theory being put up, and I think Hobsbawm was the great luminary wheeled out at the end of that one, who said, you can't do any of this, you know, you're not historians, forget it. And then we had Michael Chisholm the next year, when it became Hazelgrove, Spriggs and Green, to bring in the geographers, and Chisholm got up and said, you can't do any of this, you're not geographers. And this was all 1976, 1977, 1977. I think that was another reason why Colin and Andrew, in particular, after these discouraging experiences, said, you know, right, let's do it ourselves, and take the fight to the enemy. But those early BAR volumes were also very important in terms of the interdisciplinary mix, which TAG then exploited hugely in later times. Because Matt is now out in Canberra, isn't he? So anyway, when I was changing lifestyles from being an archaeologist to a geographer, in reorganising the office, I did come across some memorabilia which I want to share with you. First of all, I discovered my TAG t-shirt from the last time it was here in Southampton, when it was Eurotag, because 1992 was, of course, the Maastricht Treaty and enlargement, and we had Eurotag, and on the back of Eurotag, which I'll put on to model it for you, because I think this is the right moment. This hasn't been worn for 16 years, so and it was extra large in those days. So here we go, and there we go. Oops, there we go. And this was designed by David Wheatley. These little standing stones, which are the number of countries that were then in Eurotag, and on the back is the definitive list of tour dates, right, up to 1992. So there you go. And it starts with the 79 one. And it was a tremendous occasion. All the organisers were a bit bowled over because we went for Eurotag and they responded, and we were expecting 300. And if my memory serves me right, we had closer to 800. This was the very first programme for TAG, which of course is before Photoshop or anything like that. Hence this very early view of cognitive archaeology, with that pot on that beady eyes. I think it's a wonderful thing, little people holding hands. That's how we saw it all in 1979. I don't know who actually drew that, but it probably was Robin Torrance. I don't know if Andrew can remember. That was the one. But anyway, when you opened it up, this was the TAG manifesto, which is just brilliant, and which sets it out that we never have possessed a forum and so on. And on it goes. It's seen as the first of an annual series, so it started with good positive vibes there. Format of 5 sessions, topics reflected on all the things that we've been talking about there, about involving everyone. And then we had that famous quote from David Clarke about the murky exhalation that passes for thought in British archaeology. And then we had here, while some of the gloom has lifted since his comment, the mists of time into which British archaeologists gaze need to be finally dispelled by some powerful theoretical equivalent. Isn't that wonderful? This is Andrew's point about the young Turks. There they are, all revved up, you know, ready to go down the long highway. And there we are. So that was 1979. And this was the tentative programme. That's wonderful. For the life of me, I seem to have chaired a session here, and I can't remember who was in it. I really can't. I imagine Robin Torrance was, Jeff Bailey, very likely, Paul Mellors, possibly, but I haven't been able to check that with him. I can't remember who else was there. And there's obviously no one in the room who was there, so please let me know. But this is the trouble, the old memory is dim. But Andrew organised a session, Ian was there, John Gledhill from Anthropology UCL, and Richard Hodges to give us the medieval view. And on the right there, look at that for prices. Non-residential students, £4, unbelievable. Can't even get a pint for £4 now. And there's Sorby Hall, which is now gone. I haven't done the inflation and the RPI on that, but I'm sure what we're paying today is still very good value, so that's great. And this was the second tag in 1980 at Southampton, reflecting very accurately the kind of systems theory that dominated the world at that time. And in the space of a year, we'd moved into parallel sessions. There we have down the left symposia titles with the modest names of Explanation Revisited, which became a book, and then morphogenetic approaches to sociocultural change and dynamics of political and economic change, and then workshops on the other side dealing with burial. I'm sure Bob Chapman was in that one, and so on, with international speakers all laid on. And then the other one which I found, which I suppose I was involved with as well, along with many people here, Tim was also one of the organisers, and Duncan likewise, was Eurotag in 1992, and that was when I think TAG really went very large. And one of the reasons for it going very large was we had this debate in 1992 which celebrated the 30 years of Lou Binford's famous paper, Archaeology as Anthropology, which many see as the sort of birth of what was then called the new archaeology and got things going. And we had 4 speakers there. That was Lou and Colin, and Chris Tilley and John Barrett. And we took a video of that conference. It meanders on for a very long time. It's absolutely fascinating. And you can start to spot people in the audience who you suddenly realise you know who you're looking at. But I just thought I'd give you a couple of minutes, I promise it won't be any more, of Lou Binford in his pomp. And he'd come over to really tell us where we'd all gone wrong. It was a pivotal moment in archaeology, kind of one of those transition points really, where one order of theory was coming to an end and another one was clearly going to be ascendant. Whether that comes out in the debate is another matter, but I thought it would be interesting for you to see how theory was discussed back then, and this tape can now go into the TAG archive.
It is now my very great pleasure to introduce Lou Binford, once described as the oldest new archaeologist in town, honorary graduate of this university, and without whom I can truthfully say we would not be sitting here today in such numbers, nor with such anticipation. Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to see so many people, and I have to tell you before I start that we've had some collusion. Some of us who've done these kinds of panels before have generally commented, well, we know what we're all going to say, and it's boring. So it may not be boring to many of you, but presentations like this tend to be safe strategies. You normally talk about what you've already said or already done, and everybody else already knows that, and so it's a rehash. I've decided to do a little different and talk about perhaps a few points that I've not written about. And suppose the first thing I will do is say to Chris Tilley that I'm not going to argue with him. Let's grant that basically his positions can be held. They obviously are. But one can argue the way he does. They have obviously been so argued not only by Chris but many postmodernists. And my comments are really addressed to archaeologists who argue like Chris but don't know it. I want to make a distinction. Now, of course, the word interpretation is an old one. It was appearing in 1962. But many arguments by contemporary archaeologists have the form of logic, which many postmodernist arguments have, and that is that any kind of observations or the words we use for those observations are referred to a concept, and it is this referral process. The archaeological record is a text. And so having made that referral, then the logic of what text is then found out to talk about the archaeological record. So the primary knowledge claim that's being made is in the argument of referral. And that is a very different kind of argument than is generally made by, quote, hard scientists. Hard scientists make relational arguments. They basically make an argument that some observational material.
I think you get the idea. These were matters that concerned Lou very much at that time, and which contributed to those sorts of debates, and as to really where the heart and soul of an organisation like TAG was going to go. So I thought I'd just share that with you, and that's all I have to say. Thank you very much, Clive.
I've got a story which is a bit relevant to the position of Lou Binford at that time, because I always imagined that people like Binford, whenever they turn up at a grand conference like this and go to a plenary session, he's not short of people coming up to him afterwards and saying, "Do let's go to the restaurant." And I was astonished when I was here in 92, when I was out on the street looking, as you do, for a pizzeria or some sort of a fish and chip shop, you know, to slake your hunger before getting on to more important things. I was astonished to see Lou Binford by himself doing the same thing. I was amazed. I thought, my goodness, he's gone out of fashion. The evening ended up well for him, because he went into one of these pizza places, and you know, there were a few other postgrads who sat down at the same table. And the last I saw of him, he was having a whale of a time chatting with them. But it just kind of showed how the way fashions rise and fall. And that vision of Binford on the streets, on the mean streets of Southampton, looking for a fish and chip shop, that's one of the great reminiscences of TAG.
Christian, yes.
The difference is incredible to 1980, when he first appeared there in that conference. Because I remember him, he would stand there and people would, circle around him and approach him all the time, because he was the centerpiece of that 1980 conference, really. But you also create a lot of tension or controversy, especially among the TAG graduate students, because he was so aggressive in the way he tried to criticize those he disagreed with, and he didn't make any discrimination between a senior colleague or a young graduate student, and a lot of people found that a disgrace. So he really went hard on a number of younger researchers and graduate students, and he lost a lot at that conference. And that was already when post-processual archaeology was on its way forward. So that was that early battle there. It took place in 1980, and he lost the popular support by his aggressiveness, basically.
I have a slightly different, Brian Boyd from Columbia. I have a slightly different memory, and I'm surprised to hear you say that, Andrew, because this was the TAG I did my first paper as a postgrad. And what I remember about the debates in particular was seeing the Southampton audiences. You could see exactly where their loyalties lay to the certain members of the panel, because when Clive introduced each of the speakers, Colin and Lou got enormous rounds of applause, and Chris and John got no applause whatsoever. So that's a slightly different memory of that.
Again, sort of exercise my right to share. I'll ask a couple of questions to people online. name TAG, or TAG, as the short abbreviation for Theoretical Archaeology Group, those three words are actually present on the programme for the first Southampton session in '77. Interestingly, it doesn't appear on the poster for the first conference in Sheffield, which is just advertised as a conference on theoretical archaeology. But the name and the idea of a sort of semi-unofficial organisation lying behind the event seems to have been there right from the beginning. Was that the intention?
Andrew may recall better than I do. I think it was quite simple. We wanted to be talking about theoretical archaeology, and certainly by the third one, first public one, it was something that was going to continue. And then sometimes the acronym TAG was used, sometimes it wasn't. I don't remember more to it than that, but maybe Andrew can add something.
No, I don't. I think we were attracted by the idea of a title with an acronym. I remember you were particularly attracted by it.
Nothing like
This was in the days before acronyms were quite the all-purpose thing that they are today. I mean, they're all over the place now. As a
I'm
retired
not sure we invented acronyms.
No, I'm not saying we did. I'm not saying we did. But as a retired university teacher, I can't help noticing that every 6 months or so, my former colleagues are using a different set of acronyms to talk about academic politics.
Clive made a comment about the communications technology of the 1970s. The first one was set up, the first computer appeared in the Department of Archaeology in 1983. So we're at 6 years pre-computer, no email, no computer. How on earth we produce copies of programmes, let alone talk to our colleagues in Sheffield, I have absolutely no idea. Actually getting a conference together, even a small-scale one, was quite an achievement in those days. So, Will.
Yeah. 2 points. Well, one is going through Clive's church, really, and all the venues that TAG has been to. It does document the colonisation of theoretical archaeology of Britain, I think. I mean, you can actually, in the early days, there were lots of universities who were really quite anti-theory. And you could gradually see them falling, finally with Exeter a couple of years ago. But it really did seem to follow that pattern. And I think for about half of the last 30 years, theoretical archaeology was still in the minority. And we forget that there has been this kind of polarity. Even at IFA last year, I was hearing people say, "My God, you don't go to that one, do you?" So there is a kind of, I'm not saying that applies to all people at IFA, I'll get shot, but I think there is still a polarity that does exist in the British archaeology that thinks we're all nuts. But I think we are now, in the last, say, 15 years, become the majority. I don't know if you agree with that. The second point I wanted to make on a completely different subject was I expect Duncan still to speak, aren't you? But he's responsible. I mean, when I was at school, I never played football. I was terrible. And Duncan's responsible for me taking up football in the last few years by the TAG five-a-side football match every year, which was wonderful. But it's not happening this year, is it? Which is a great shame. But we played last year, and ever since that, I've been playing almost every week. You would. Looking at me, you might wonder why. Thank you.
It's Margaret from Bournemouth University. Now, it was, in a way, it's a pity that there's someone who wasn't able to be here, Biserka Gajdarska, because the area project paid her a few months to do some research on the history of TAG. Which she has finished and hopefully will be published soon. So, for example, issues of gender are discussed in her work, but also she has been looking at the different themes that have been, or the changes in themes and discussions throughout the years in TAG. And I would like to have your opinion or your perspective of how these different themes have changed throughout the years. What do you think it has been? There have been sort of the fashions, the main fashions throughout the years in terms of, you know, main issues under discussion?
I think one of the big switches has been towards the management and organisation and public face of TAG. I think in the first few years we were thinking of theory as something that's enabled us to find out more about the past, or to think more coherently about the past that we were investigating. And it's been, you know, I guess, the second half of TAG, when lots of people come in and raise management issues, political issues, issues of whether we were getting our message across properly, issues of whether we should be on television more, all those political things that come in kind of the second half of TAG's life, in my perception. I don't think we talk much about management and stuff like that in the early years. Sorry, I don't mean to convey the impression that I think that's a turn for the worse. On the contrary, I think it's very good.
Some things have receded. I think many themes, perhaps reworded, continue to be talked about. Indeed, the big themes in archaeology are not resolved. We don't hear much about Marxist archaeology as such anymore, and one could probably name other themes, rather predictably, that have receded, that in that form have gone out of fashion. Although I think many of the underlying issues are the big problems that are still discussed.
Time for catastrophe theory, Colin?
Catastrophe theory is now those fractal systems. Really, we just call it fractals now.
One of the things that has failed to emerge consistently in TAG is a sort of period balance, and it still is overwhelmingly prehistoric conference. That's probably not the best way of putting it. And I've struggled, well, eventually you may hear, I've struggled consistently to try and introduce the medieval sort of antidote to some of this, and also Roman archaeology, although track emerged directly out of engagement with TAG, Roman archaeology similarly is underrepresented all too often. Well, actually, not all too often. But it's medieval archaeology, and Barrett and I have had a couple of sessions where we've tried to address that specifically, and failed, and colleagues of mine have also tried the same thing. It's not always, if you're looking for a continuing theme, then that's something that I think we could address.
On that point, it's one of the, there used to be an advertisement for Heineken beer which says it reaches parts that other beers can't reach. TAG is yet to reach the strongholds of classical archaeology. There are maybe one or two classical archaeologists in this room, myself and Rochette, and I don't know if there's anyone else. Maybe they call themselves Roman archaeologists rather than classical archaeologists. On the whole, that has, it hasn't really touched that field very much, or not directly, indirectly perhaps. And I just want to, there are still a lot of people who might agree with a comment by a former professor from Oxford. New archaeology is like nouvelle cuisine. Superficially attractive but nutritionally unsatisfying. Which is, you won't surprise you to know that's the comment from John Borden. But it's an area that hasn't been very much affected, or again, directly, indirectly perhaps, by this conference. And bearing that in mind, you all described how this came, how TAG emerged in the late 70s when there was an expansion in the universities, and there was an expansion in the number of people applying to do archaeology. Unfortunately, a material fact of the present day is there is an overall decline in the number of people applying to do archaeology degrees in Britain. Bearing that in mind, decline more in prehistory than in some other fields such as the classical field. Now, what does that portend?
Smaller tax.
We get an answer from the floor from Martin.
Actually, I just wanted to take up Duncan's very important observation before we lose it. As a medievalist, you are actually obliged to follow quite closely for other disciplines in addition to archaeology. So we have to follow what historians are doing, what historians are doing, linguists are doing. That has to be done, because otherwise, that's James rustling. Otherwise, your audience doesn't know what you're talking about. And so, I mean, it was interesting that for example, in history, with Patrick Wormald's Ideal Reality, we suddenly got a very interesting contrast between a pre-structuralist and a structuralist view of history, but he was rather on his own. It really didn't take off in the Anglo-Saxon world. The art historians were well ahead of us in post-structuralist reflexive thinking and so on. I mean, they sort of were giving it up some years ago. And so we tried to catch up with that and compare it when we were doing Anglo-Saxon sculpture and so on. In other words, lots of different audiences. Now, I don't know whether that means that TAG should be multidisciplinary, and I don't know if it would work. I think it might be extremely interesting, however. And I was a bit sad about the comments about anthropology. I wasn't quite sure I followed them, since Mike Rose was an anthropologist, so I don't quite know why anthropologists were not invited and took part in the discussions. You know, I think that a lot of what we have developed as theories archaeologists has got a much wider platform. It's got internationally too, it has a much wider platform. So for me, there's a question which is sort of hanging here about how far this conference should have gone more international and more interdisciplinary more quickly.
Well, we have had some anthropologists, indeed we've had some classical archaeologists, but they haven't kept coming. I mean, Ernest Gellner was at one of the tags. They haven't kept coming. That's probably our fault, but maybe not exclusively so.
I think I partly answer your comment, Martin, by saying that TAG has been organised over the last 30-odd years by a great host of departments. Colin gave us a list. In a sense, most archaeology departments around the country have now hosted it, with one or two exceptions. And in a sense, it's for them to set the agenda. Yeah. And it always has been for them to set the agenda. The TAG National Committee doesn't prescribe what should be covered or what shouldn't be covered. And I know from being an organiser myself over the years that, of course, that organising committee is only responding to what it's sent in, yes, what it receives from all the other people out there in the archaeological world. And there have been occasions when perhaps it's drifted in one direction, perhaps it's drifted in another. But in a sense, TAG is the ultimate democracy, in the sense that it's entirely dependent on what it's given to work with. And in that sense, if there's a strong feeling for Roman archaeology or medieval archaeology, then it will come through a strong sense of people wanting to be involved in the meeting, in the conference, doing something about it. And I would say that the face that TAG has had is the face of what people have wanted to happen.
It's a democracy with a very narrow constituency, that is to say, archaeology departments. And the archaeology departments do have this other agenda, which is to survive as archaeological departments. So I'm just wondering now, as many of them move into bigger things called schools of antiquity or whatever they're called, whether TAG would like to also adjust its base. I don't know what the answer to this is. I'm just really sounding out what people feel. It might become too broad, too flaky, too woolly, you know, to have any bite as theory. But I just think that theory is something that happens in other humanities, and sometimes we forget that.
I think one might argue that one of the reasons why TAG has survived so long and has done so well, even within what you might call a limited frame, is the comparatively informal structure. It's not a campaigning organisation which exists to do anything else. Its one function, as I understand it, is to hold a conference every year. And holding a conference responds, if you can find a university prepared to host it 2 or 3 years in advance, then the programme it's succeeded. And the conferences then largely respond to what is offered. There's very little attempt to, rather like research council, there's very little thematic programme research where you say there will be sessions of this and this. Most of it is response mode.
Yeah, can you hear? Is it working? It is working. Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to pick up on what was being said, how it's reflected wider things going on. Somebody mentioned Marxism isn't discussed very much anymore. I suspect its time will come around again. But the classic one is probably gender. My first one was 1980. I can't remember which subsequent one this happened at, but I vividly remember one of the gender sessions, and John Barrett banging his head on the desk, shouting, "Why are you allowing men into this session?" and there were indeed women-only sessions, and the popularity of that sort of fell. But now I notice that Rachel's not here, is she? But I see Rachel's organising a women-only internet discussion group, which to me goes back to some of those 1980 sessions, which and I think in other things you can see this sort of great the movements of what people are interested in and what people are doing. Over the time, I don't know whether that's being documented by Ms. Erskine with her project, but with the titles of the papers and the sessions, it might be interesting to look at.
I think it's interesting that TAG has, not just through this session, but through the work which Marga mentioned that Seskia Gardask has been doing in Durham, TAG has become a focus for intellectual study and research. It's like a writer knowing that he or she has made it when she's the subject of a PhD thesis by somebody. The fact that we're now significant enough to be studied, taken seriously, I think is very interesting. And I guess this work will show something of the way in which intellectual trends and passions in British archaeology have been, and wider, have been reflected in the papers given. Looking at Margaret, I think that will be an interesting sort of snapshot of changing research passions when we see that. And I should emphasise that this is one part of several projects on the history of TAG. Ms. Erskine's work, which we hope will continue. One of the things many of us have become painted with, one of the reasons for doing this session now, is the feeling that we may be getting to a point where some of the memories and certainly some of the documentation may get lost. Even putting together a full set of programs has proved impossible. If anybody's got a copy of the program for the Sheffield event of 1978, we'd love to see one. I think we found somewhere other copies of most of them. It just suggests that even over 30 years, 31 years, it's easy for documentation to get lost. Every time you throw out stuff from your filing cabinet, potentially important stuff has gone. We've all had to do it. Okay, we're going to move on to next week. Next week, Tim Darvill, who was a student in Southampton when these things were happening in the 70s. So, Tim.
Indeed, I'm going to open this really with a perspective not just from an organiser of TAG, but from a participant of TAG in the early days at least. I came to Southampton in 1976 and met at that time 3 other young lads in the same sort of situation. Roger Thomas, who's sitting directly in front of me, Bob Smith, who's no longer with us, I'm afraid, and Mike Parker Pearson. And between the 4 of us, we enjoyed all the things that Colin and others have been speaking about as the sort of flavour of archaeology that was going on at this time, not just in Southampton, but over at Cambridge as well, the Spriggs and Hazelgrove meetings, the events that were going on there, and at Sheffield as well, as Andrew's pointed out. And I think it's easy to forget that these were really quite exciting times because people had discovered this notion of networking, I suppose not for the first time, but at least in the particular incarnation that was happening at that time. And people getting together and working things out and trying to talk about new ideas, picking up on material, seemed to be something which happened a lot. And Roger and Mike and Bob and myself thought it would be a top idea to organise a conference ourselves about new approaches to archaeology. In fact, we did that in 1977, the same year as the first TAG, such that in fact in Southampton in December 1977 there were 2 conferences. The one that we organised called New Approaches to Our Past, and that happened just a few days after the first TAG meeting, which we already heard a certain amount about. So this really was quite a time discussing new ideas and breaking old molds and thinking about things off into the future. that first tag really sets a lot of the trends for future tags, and I happen to have got a copy of the first announcement and program about it, and it starts off with the Friday evening. It was over a weekend, 9th of December, 8 o'clock to 10 p.m, meeting the Crown and Sceptre in Burgess Road, Southampton. And that, as far as I can see, is where the first main session happened. And in a sense, that's always been the case ever since. It also established the idea that there would be informal accommodation to be arranged, and that research students would sleep on the floors of other research students, and the host organisation would be a host in the true sense of the word, of looking after the delegates who came. And that's a tradition which has largely stayed intact over the 30 years or so. Now, I have to say that the four of us that I've already mentioned were undergraduates when the first tag happened. And there's a very clear steer that, in fact, it was open to postgraduates and researchers and members of staff. And the four of us were not awfully happy about that, because we really felt we wanted to go and hear all these things that were going on. And I think some meetings over coffee were held, as I remember it, Colin, when it was decided that the four of us could come if we made the tea and worked the projector. And I think that was probably the deal that was eventually struck. And I can't quite remember who of us did what, but I remember rushing about fixing slides in the projector at some point, and I'm sure Roger was pouring cups of tea right behind me. And that's how it worked. The result, of course, was that we weren't allowed to go to the following one in Sheffield, 78, which is probably why there's no 1978 paper in the tag archive, I'm afraid to say. But perhaps we'll be able to patch that in before too long. Now, there was also this concern about the nature of the papers. Colin's point earlier on that theory was a bit moribund also extended to the fact that it was well known that people wrote on rather a lot as well. And an early premise of tag was that the papers would be short and that there would be discussion. In fact, straight after you're told about what the meeting in Burgess Road is, you're told that, note, the timing allows for 15-minute papers plus 10 minutes discussion, or a 10-minute paper plus 15 minutes of discussion. It is essential, and that's in capitals on the typewriter, that the speakers keep within the allotted time. It then announces that egg timers will ring after 10 minutes. Well, as it happens, I have a tag artifact in my bag, which is one of the egg timers. And this is what happened. I'll set it ringing, let it go now, and we'll hear it ring in a few minutes' time. So, the tag egg timer revisits tag.
Will you be shutting that when it rings?
That was indeed the trick. Andrew remembers it exactly, that when the bell rings, you have to shut up and sit down. So the egg timers were absolutely great. Other traditions which were established at that time have already been touched on. The Saturday night party is, of course, something which has happened 31 times or so now. The meal, as Colin said, was a communal meal the first time. Hilary Howard and Sue Davis and I think Sue Shannon and one or two others, Elaine Morris, were involved in cooking it in difficult conditions, as we've heard. My recollection was that it wasn't salad, but it was chili con carne, but stand to be corrected on that.
Absolutely right.
Yes. So we have these traditions: floor space, short papers, party, and the final event at tag meetings, I think again about 31 times, has been for there to be a tag committee meeting. And the tag committee meeting must have started very small, in fact just Sheffield and Southampton, because the principle on which it's predicated is that every university that has held tag is allowed to send a delegate to the tag national committee. Interesting self-perpetuating democracy, which perhaps helps answer Martin's point earlier on, in fact. And so that group has grown bigger and bigger, but it traditionally meets on the final lunchtime of tag, and its principal duty, as we've already heard, is to sort out where tag is going to happen in the future. And generally speaking, these days there are 2 or 3 venues lined up in advance so that the preparations can be made, because tag has become a big event. And it started small, but it's become really one of the landmarks of the archaeological conference scene, certainly in this part of Europe. We've heard about imitators in Scandinavia, and of course there are imitators in the United States these days. Tag has become a successful brand which seems to export quite well in the sort of terms that we said. It is very open. There are almost no rules to it other than the organising department organises tag. And that's how it works. And it's worked very successfully over the years. I think the other important point is that almost everybody, I suspect, in this audience, and I certainly count myself as one, tag is the place where you gave your first paper. Tag is the place where you first organised a major session, where you could invite the people you wanted to invite to come and talk about the topic you wanted to talk about. Tag in 1980 in Southampton, I organised that session, Clive pointed out, on burial, and invited people from America and people from Britain to come and talk about burial. That's a very trendy thing. I don't think it's been on the agenda of Tag for quite a long time. Whoever was asked the question about things going on and off the agenda, I think probably burial studies is one that slips, along with catastrophe theory and one or two other things, onto the side burner or the back burner. So this kind of opportunity is something which Tag has offered, and many, many people now who are giving conference papers all over the world cut their teeth at Tag and receive their first feedback on their papers at Tag. In Bournemouth, we hosted Tag in 1997, and in all the years I've lived in Bournemouth, we've never had any snow to speak of in Bournemouth, except in 1997, on the night of the first evening of Tag, and everybody went to bed in the usual way of Tag and woke up in the morning to see 3 or 4 inches of snow, which in Dorset means total and utter chaos in every single quarter of existence. And nobody turned up to open the breakfast room, and nobody was around to make all the tea and coffees and so on that we needed. And even though I only lived a few minutes walk from the university, it actually took us 35 minutes to get in, because the pavements and the road were so crowded with broken down cars and all the rest of it. In the time Hallett tradition, thank you very much.
Very popular. Yes. You can say on this end.
Yeah, okay. Well, I went to my first Tag in 1985, so I'm not entirely qualified to be in such illustrious company in that sense. But I was keen to participate in a more prominent role for that very reason, because Tag is a democracy and it's about democratisation. And also, I have been, since 1985, to every Tag that's been held since. So that's a pretty good record, and I think qualifies me. But also, I'm not an academic. I graduated in 1978 and never went back to university again, I'm pleased to say. And except for Tag, obviously. And so again, I wanted to represent that as part of what Tag is about, bringing people in from outside of academia. And it's disappointing in a way to hear how exclusive it started out, but it's a good thing that it didn't stay that way for long. And it's a great strength. I remember once I graduated, I just went into the field, dug around for a few years. Tag began to emerge onto the scene, and I remember being asked, am I a processualist or a post-processualist? No, I'm an archae-bloody-ologist. And that was the response. And you began to see, if we were not too careful, we could see some divisions creeping into the discipline, which was always something I didn't like. And so when I did attend my first Tag in 1985, it was a source of great relief to me to find that I wasn't the only person speaking bollocks as an archaeologist. I finally found my proper home. And that it was possible to do archaeology in the way that I wanted to do it, in the field, well, as a medieval pottery specialist as I was by then, and have been ever since, and yet to be included into a group that looked at archaeology as a whole, and that was really important, because I've always felt that, you know, as a specialist, you can't just be a specialist, you have to broaden out and talk to the entire audience. Since my appointment in Southampton as medieval pottery specialist, I've risen to the heady heights of curator of archaeology. And as any good museum archaeologist, of course, I don't throw anything away, so I've got a substantial Tag archive here, including the programme for my first Tag in 1985. And talking of technology, if you look at the Tag 85 Glasgow timetable, It's handwritten on a piece of graph paper and subsequently photocopied X hundred times. And in a way, it's a shame it isn't like that now, you know. But at TAG, yeah. So at TAG 85, as I say, I found well, I wouldn't say it was a calling, but I found a place in the discipline which has been dear to me ever since. And only the very next year, London 86, I was organising my first session. And this was on the back of a conversation with John Barrett at the party. TAG 85 Glasgow party was a cracker, actually. It was really good, I must be said. So here's what I wrote in March 1986. Dear John, it's time to think about this year's TAG. And although I was partially drunk when you suggested it, I'm still very interested in organising a session on medieval archaeology. And go on to explain what my aims were, and the response from John, very prompt. Dear Duncan, thanks for your letter. Sorry for the delay in replying. I too only have the vaguest recollections of our conversation. It was the birth of a beautiful relationship. He goes on to say, I can remember being annoyed at some of what had been said. Barrett was annoyed, now there's... Yes, we got on famously. And he finishes by saying, I have spent a couple of months asking people who the guy in the Cramps t-shirt was. That's what I was wearing at the party. Now I know. So, not to be outdone, Clive, I have here what is left of my Cramps t-shirt. How you washed it? I last wore it at my 40th birthday party, which actually coincided with the funeral of Princess Diana. And, still fits me. I haven't washed it since then. So I must put it on. Right. Now, that's my other props. It says persecuted prophets with B-movie souls. That really speaks to me. The session we did on medieval archaeology in London was held in a badminton court. And I remember using a shuttlecock as a prop on that occasion to explain that as the chair, my role was to behave like a sort of net, controlling the debate as it went backwards and forwards. And the aim was to invite prehistorians. Richard Bradley attended and was prominent by being the only prehistorian present, but we did get a very good session together. The following year at Bradford, Hal Dalwood and I organised another session, and that went on to, we repeated it again in Sheffield in, what would that be, 88. And I've gone on ever since. Now, my other props that I've brought along with me include a programme from TAG 90 Lampeter. Now, one of the great things about TAG for me has always been the journey. It's always been getting Lampeter was an epic journey. And it made it all the better. It wasn't a hugely attended TAG, it must be said, but everybody who was there had a real sense of achievement. We arrived, I think I arrived about midday. There was supposed to be some sort of plenary session happening that afternoon, but the bar was open. And I arrived about midday, installed myself in front of a pint, and waited for somebody else to turn up. Gradually, more and more people turned up. Gradually, more and more people were drinking. And by the end of the evening, I think about 1 o'clock, the bar closed, we drunk all the beer that they'd installed for the week. That's a sort of important part of TAG, really, and an important challenge to all those people, because you just cannot afford to run out of beer. Fortunately, they got the supply in the next day, and it was fine, and the whole of the rest of the conference passed in a nice fug of alcoholic delight. So, for me, as somebody outside of the academic frame, TAG has been an opportunity to rejuvenate my interest in the discipline, to go to sessions that are completely unrelated to what I do every day, despite like moaning occasionally about the lack of medieval archaeology, I do enjoy going to sessions that have nothing to do with medieval archaeology or pottery, and to rediscover the breadth of the discipline and the simple thrill of being able to talk to people on the same level from all areas of the profession and just enjoy the company of so many archaeologists. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So that language of TAG was really interesting, actually, because it was just after German reunification, you remember? And there was a session about the new Germany and about why Germans are not being very interested in theory and what might be done about it. And it was all done in the usual TAG way. But then I remember in the evening, the Germans themselves had booked a room to talk about it themselves. And I remember walking past that room, and they were going at it hammer and tongs. The windows just steamed up. I don't know what came out of it.
I think we may have a witness of that.
I think we may.
Well, John, hang on, let's get the line for you. What really happened in that room then?
Well, like summer, we founded a German section of TAG as a thing, and of course it's pretty obvious that it had to happen abroad, but it's been going on ever since. Not all of us stayed in this country, but yeah, that's what happened.
Rather successful pottery.
I'm just remembering, like Duncan, there are certain moments that you do remember. The one I remember very clearly was Durham, in whenever it was. You can tell me here, I think. But it was, I think it was Durham '82, and we all went to a squash court where a play was put on. And I think the play was called Bosnia. If I remember right, it may have been Mike Pearson, not Parker Pearson, but Mike Pearson's group. And there was this wonderful disabled actor, and the play consisted in throwing him around the squash court. It was very, very violent. And we were all standing there, and of course nobody intervened, which was the whole point about the play. It was extremely powerful, very TAG-like. And TAG was able to produce these sorts of moments which started to look at the subject in rather different ways, although I must say the actual direct relevance of Bosnia to archaeology in that instance was one that still eludes me, but it was a very powerful moment.
I think Duncan's reminded us of another phenomenon of TAG. Especially, I guess, in the mid-80s, no TAG was regarded as a properly successful TAG without at least one outburst from John Barrett. Those are legendary events. I doubt if anybody's got them on tape or film, but they should have been.
There was a session, I think, about gender or feminism, where he shouted at Richard Black, "Stand up and defend yourself as a man."
Hi, my name is Michael Tierney from the Archaeology Company. Can I keep it going, keep the fuzzy feel, the good feelings going here? I kind of echo what the last speaker was saying, but I came to TAG from a different kind of perspective. I wanted to check beforehand that there's no other Irish archaeologists here, are there? All right, because the kind of archaeological tradition that I was brought up in was such that I found that I could become a good field archaeologist trained by Mick Monk from Sheffield, which goes back to the big dig tradition and how these things pull people and ideas together. I was a good field archaeologist. I had an interest in politics. I was very politically active as a Marxist, considering myself thinking about being a full-time activist in the Socialist Workers' Party and so on. And then I came over to TAG because the reason I was looking elsewhere for ideas, and I was also a postgraduate I was doing postgraduate studies in geography. I was working on an excavation in Dublin for a year. It was hard work. I'd been looking around and I discovered Bruce Trigger, Shanks and Tilly, and that there was such a thing as a Theoretical Archaeology Group. So you guys saved me from being a geographer, a full-time member of the Socialist Workers' Party, hopefully made me a more rounded human being. I'm not going to finish on thanks, because there's one other thing that I want to get at. In the context that I come from, where at the time in the 80s and 90s, much like here in other archaeological traditions, the archaeology was deeply conservative within, you know, embedded in kind of all kinds of empiricism, but it had a conservative politics as well. And I think it's interesting, if we go back to the plenary session yesterday, that there are echoes of this, the leaflet that was used for the first tag, with some of the leaflets that Alan Shapp was showing yesterday from 68. I'm not saying that this was 68, but I don't think it's an accident. Whoever designed this was making, there's resonances here. And I think underlying the whole tag for me, and for other people that have been in and around the conference with over the years, is a kind of, there's a radicalism underlying the whole kind of thing that feeds into the power of the ideas. The ideas are never the ideas for ideas' sake, but they're always about engaging in society with other people, and about bringing broader communities hopefully into the discipline. A lot of this is on very vague kind of levels, but it's important that these ideas do kind of sweep through the ether, the various sessions that I've been involved in, and they were clearly there in the kind of the first, in the initial program, you know, setting the fog lamps. I mean, it's a great kind of way of putting it, but behind that is about breaking the bonds of older traditions and opening up ideas and new ways of thinking. And this isn't just a personal thing. The effect that you've had has already been mentioned in Scandinavian countries, Germany, and it certainly has affected a number of people in Ireland, and it continues to affect people who work in academia and who are also working in the field. So just conclude with a thank you.
Two other things. First, as long as I can remember, there's never been any decent audio equipment to tag. We've always and speaking as somebody with a really quiet voice and a very bad presentational manner, I feel I've suffered a lot from that. The other thing is all the books and collected papers that have spun off tag. There's no possibility for Pop Monkey or Import to ever produce an edited volume without having had tag to try out papers and get people interested. And if there's a sort of histories being written, it'd be useful to document the number of collections of papers that come out of tag, because it must be a hell of a lot now. BARs, Oxbow, all those publishers. And of course they've given it an importance beyond just the conference, because they're there.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I don't think it's ever really been part of the tag philosophy to put on a session which would lead to a publication. But in fact, many of the sessions have been good enough to warrant it. I don't think, you're quite right, I don't think there is any sort of, even the beginning of a list of the more permanent, you've got one.
The website on the antiquity site's got the beginnings of a list on it. For about 10 years, Routledge did, in fact, the word is sponsor, Colin. Andrew, they certainly participated in the tag series. There are 5 or 6 volumes, I think, that. But there's a lot of BARs, there's an awful lot of bespoke volumes of periodicals and so on, which have come from that. It would be nice. So if you've got papers from tag, and send them to Martin to add to the antiquity website. It'd be nice to build up that bit of it. There's about a dozen things on it so far.
It'd be really easy to document the history of tag. Obviously part of it is the historical analysis, but there's a material archive. There's the programs, the abstracts in paper version. Many of those can exist in scanned version, but it's still nice to have one of the original paper copies back there. And there's all the longer documented, the bigger, longer lasting intellectual legacy of tag through publications that have arisen from it. And also, as we've seen here, the material culture of tag from egg timers to t-shirts. We're being given the 3-minute extension. Julian, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Julian Thomas.
Oh, I hesitate to say anything, having not been here to hear what's been said so far, probably repeating what's already been said. But I think I would say that for me, tag was a formative experience, because I came from a university with a rather small archaeology department, and was aware of these great debates carrying on in the rest of the world. And tag, I first came to it in 1981 when I went to Sheffield to do my master's, and from there went down to Reading, wasn't it, 1981. But there was a famous session which became Ideology, Power and Prehistory, and saw for the first time in the flesh all these figures whose work I'd been reading. And it was a revelation for me, actually, because throughout my academic career up to out of books and journal articles and so on, and to actually see those debates in the making, to see people actually working through the issues, was fantastic. So it was like seeing history being made.
That's sort of an echo of one or two points made earlier, but the way really in which, yes, it was a place where people tried out ideas without too much fear of criticism. Not always true, but criticism which on the whole was given in a spirit of constructive help.
Not always.
Not always. And yes, it was, as other people say, used the word democratic. Postgraduate students could contribute just as much as senior professors, and in fact senior professors were remarkable by their almost total absence. And so it was and the thing that's always struck me is the way in which it's maintained a really very young average age of the attenders. And in some ways the breeding ground for future ideas for the development of archaeology. I don't know whether, Colin, you want to make final comments from your end?
No, I don't feel entitled to.
You produced
We are the ancestors, and all that remains for us is to be shut up in a megalith. But not in the immediate future.
I think at that point we just have to draw this to a close and thank everyone involved, including the ancestors on my left and right, for starting the whole thing and giving us an opportunity to talk about their legacy, or at least a part of their legacy to archaeology. Paola for organising the session, and all the other contributors here, but also so many of you for contributing. Oral history is made partly by the more serious reflection, partly by the anecdotes, and I think I don't think we've heard all of the most scabrous anecdotes yet. Maybe those will come out later in the evening, but there's more to be told about the dark side of the past. But thank you also to the team who have been recording it. I hope we haven't given you too many problems. And let me remind you that Pamela has copies of earlier sessions available. And thank you all very much for your valuable contribution.